Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if it's your first time coming across one of my videos. And I am the mature exotical lady, and this is episode 3 in a series of talks in which I discuss autism, high functioning autism in women. And in my last episode 3, I described and summarised around 16 traits of 33 possible traits that have been generally identified based on research in high functioning autistic people of both genders. And in this episode, I intend to summarize the remaining 17 traits for you. I'm going to start with actually going back over the 16th trait that I was starting to summarize in the previous episode, because I ran out of recording time essentially, so I apologize for that. I did list the traits in the descriptions in episode 3, so I did cover all 16 of them. Although it sounds as if I didn't really know what I was doing with my numbering. That's probably one of my I didn't really have any notes or anything like that, guys. I'm not really sort of using any sort of organized notes in this, which is sort of how I have just been doing things, really. I just don't have the time, to be honest, to sort of prepare detailed notes of a sort of running order, mainly because of my work. I spend most of my time preparing for work, and so I'm just really trying my best to do these talks based on having some reliable material that I can actually refer to, but not necessarily putting together any particular script or anything like that. So I might change that eventually once I become more sort of familiar with doing these videos for you, because what I also plan on doing is, although I'm describing and summarizing these traits in these videos, I do actually want to dedicate a video on each trait, because there's a lot of information. And what I should also add is that these traits are identified in all autistic individuals to a varying degrees and depending on the severity of the autism, because I do have to emphasize again that autism is a spectrum, so it can be very severe and be extremely disabling for some people, to not so severe, but well, I would say severe, but in other ways. So high functioning autistic individuals are independent, mostly independent, but who are generally impaired because of the cultural norms that don't accept the unusual way that high functioning autistics see the world, really, if I was to sort of summarize it like that. So that said, I will go into now what would be summarising again for you the trait number 16, which is literal interpretations and difficulty understanding idioms. So, high functioning autistic people have a tendency towards literal thinking or concrete thinking, and what this means is that that expressions and idioms, like, for example, I've got a frog in my throat, can be extremely alarming for some people, whilst an instruction to take a seat can result in others physically, literally picking up a seat, because of the way they visualize the they will visualize what is actually being said and take it literal, so act on it literally, and hence this could be the response. So this type of literal thinking can cause major issues in education in school and college and university, for example, or in the workplace, because what you'll find is that managers or teachers, lecturers, will think that potentially this high functioning autistic person is being sarcastic or ironic, you know. But the irony is actually in the fact that this literal thinking is classified as a communication deficit, an impairment in the high functioning autistic person by medical professionals, you know, and psychologists who just seem to be sort of blissfully unaware that the high functioning autistic person is simply interpreting and responding to language in the way it was originally intended to be used, you know. And so it's other people who have really subverted the language with slang and banter to sort of remove it away from its original meaning. So, you know, when we look at that example of please take a seat, that's basically a sort of slang or banter for really asking somebody to sit down. So, you know, so rather than saying, oh, please sit down, yeah, which would be clearer to the high functioning autistic person, because then they would, you know, literally know what that means, right? These other ways of expressing and language have emerged, but yet still for somebody who is high functioning autistic, they are going to be assessed as being disabled for not being able to understand that, for having a sort of communication disability, for not being able to understand that. So, you know, that's an example of how cultural differences can lead to high functioning autistic people and sort of neurotypical people, which we classify as non-autistic people, okay, see the world differently and approach the world differently and sort of live in different cultures to that extent, you know. So yes, I just wanted to sort of go back over that again because I didn't really get to explore that or sort of summarize it sufficiently the way I wanted to in episode 3. So sort of moving on then to the first of what will be the final 17 traits that I will summarize in episode 4 for you. And the next one will be naivety, you know. So naivety. And this to me is a really, really important trait to really understand, especially in high functioning autistic individuals. I say specifically for high functioning autistic individuals because with autism, when a child or when a person is severely autistic, you know, and they have most of these traits in their most severe forms, those individuals aren't going to find themselves in situations where they are alone and having to navigate the world by themselves, unsupported and unsupervised. You know, most severely affected autistic individuals or moderately affected autistic individuals operate with a support system around them, whether that is their family or whether that's paid support. They usually have enough support around them that will act as protection against some of the situations that can present a high risk to that autistic person because of this trait of being very naive in the way the world is seen and approaching the world. So that is why I sort of wanted to emphasize that. And again, because whenever I refer to autism or autistic, you know, when I'm talking about these issues in my talks and in my videos, I am really meaning to say high functioning autistic person of female gender specifically. So I think it's important that I mention that. And actually I should say, because I didn't say at the beginning, that I am not a medical professional. I purely am talking about this subject matter from the point of view of being personally diagnosed, self diagnosed as high functioning autistic, what we used to call Aspergers, and also from having family members who I believe are also on the spectrum, and also from being involved professionally with mental health services when I was in social work many years ago. And obviously, as a lawyer, I continue to have clients and have to be aware of situations with that involve people who are autistic, and that is from the point of view of they could be the subject matter if it's a vulnerable adult, or I have got or have had clients who, similar to me, are affected by high functioning autism, you know. So I come at this subject from this perspective, and not in any way from being a professional who is able to diagnose anybody with having this, being on the spectrum. So it's important that I say that. So now going back to looking at this trait of naivety. So, high functioning autistic adults can be very naive, and as a result, they can be extremely trusting, unsuspicious of others, and unsophisticated and lacking in worldly wisdom. There's no explanation for this other than it is a trait possibly caused by delayed development and maturation. So, high functioning autistic people often retain certain childlike traits for longer than neurotypical non autistic people. Okay, so a clinician would refer to somebody who is high functioning autistic with this trait as having a difficulty with perspective taking. In other words, they would have a difficulty time reading what another person might be thinking, which means that they are slow to spot the malicious intentions of other people, you know. And this trait is extremely dangerous to high functioning autistic adults who have it, as whilst they are viewed as adults in the eyes of the law, they can be easily led into participating in or admitting to criminal behaviour without realising the full consequences of their actions. And as a result, some studies have started to look into the possibility that high functional autistic adults can be led into providing false confessions by police simply because they become very agreeable to whatever story the police are pressing upon them. And this childlike innocence also makes both female and male high functional autistics of all ages at particularly high risk of falling victim to sexual predators and or physical assault. And I did touch on this in episode 2 or 3, where I mentioned actually about self-harm as well, which I think I sort of described as not just being about people who actually physically hurt themselves by cutting or other forms of physical abuse against the self. I spoke about this in a sense of high functioning autistic people putting themselves in danger when they are developing relationships, whether that be friendships or romantic relationships, or even just relationships with services, for example, like in my own situation now, or if you own a house, for example, and you have to sort of like you have to take on the services of decorators or gardeners, household repairs. You have to organise and arrange for those services to come in. It's not uncommon to find yourself being exploited financially by individuals who might pick up on that sort of childlike naivety, and also in the working environment, people will take advantage of you. There'll be other people who can sense that you're quite naive, and they will take advantage of you. They can be jealous of your skills when you're particularly high functioning and very good at what you do, and because that can be another trait for high functioning autistic people. So this naivety is extremely dangerous, and then what it leads to for a lot of us is trauma. And I spoke about traumas. Traumas have been stacking up in my own life throughout most of my life, you know, and so it's very important to be aware of that, you know. And so, unfortunately, for high functioning autistic adults, we only really seem to learn to manage this trait after having had all these bad experiences and stacking up all these traumas, and then we end up, most of us end up sort of protecting ourselves from these experiences by more or less becoming quite isolated, in the way we approach the world, or we approach our environments. So yeah, so that's really how naivety can sort of manifest itself with high functioning autistic individuals who are, as I say, less protected, because they're more likely the individuals on the spectrum who are living independently without much support at all from family, friends, or professional support. So the next one I want to talk about is reclusiveness. Sorry, this is my speech impediment, my speech problem, another trait. Reclusiveness. So, and before I sort of summarize and go into what the actual literature says about this, I just want to add that reclusiveness, to me, and how I've experienced this, it's not just about literal reclusiveness or limitations. It's also about solitude, and I think it's about we uh, how we choose certain roles in our life, the sorts of careers that we choose. So, for example, with myself, having gone into law, I chose to become a barrister because I realised that actually being a barrister would serve me better in terms of my own sort of peculiarities in the way I function in the world, because it gives me more freedom of how I do my work, when I do my work, if I want to work even, you know. And although obviously how and where and how much you want to work affects your income, it still overall allows me to cope with my ability to develop a career and have a career in a way that is less anxiety provoking for me. Whereas if I had gone down a solicitor route, I could have eventually gotten to that point. But really, as a solicitor, in the UK, you generally have to work in a team and be part of a team for quite a while before you can sort of develop your own practice and perhaps set up your own firm, and then sort of be your own boss, so to speak, and dictate the way you want to work. So it's a huge responsibility to become a solicitor and be part of a firm, because you are working towards a team target, really, for a firm, in how much revenue comes in, how many clients you try to sort of acquire as part of your caseloads. And because the whole firm relies upon all the different associate solicitors in that firm to bring in a set amount of revenue and to build the reputation of that firm. So that for me wasn't going to be something that I felt I would be able to do because of my own anxieties and my own issues, in quotes. So I chose, although I wanted to be a lawyer, I chose to go down the route where I could be self-employed from the minute I would be able to practice, literally. And although obviously there are rules, and you have to stick within those rules, and there is standards and there's codes of conduct that you must comply with, notwithstanding all that, and I still have a large amount of autonomy around how I choose to live my day-to-day life and carry out my work on a daily basis. And so that's something that I wanted to say. And I think that a lot of higher functioning autistic individuals, especially what I would call the professional high functioning autistic community, do that. we do that. We source out these sorts of careers where we are able to sort of disguise ourselves almost, I would say, or, sort of do our work unaffected or uninterrupted, or we form communities. And I think that when I sort of summarize the sort of general data and that's been sort of observed around how high functioning autistic individuals do find ways to sort of find ways of sort of functioning, okay, that seems sort of normal for them. We'll probably touch on these different ways that reclusiveness can sort of take hold and how you can recognize it to a certain extent. So not all high functioning autistic people are reclusive. However, there are many who remain on the fringes of what we would call mainstream society. Some may be reclusive not by choice, but because they have found themselves socially excluded by the non-autistic society. So, sort of neurotypical society where we live, essentially. Some may simply have a preference for solitude and have made a conscious decision to remain socially isolated or hermit-like because it suits them. And they may simply find it too exhausting being in a cultural environment which is not tailored to them, and so live their own, sort of literally live in their own world instead, And tiredness is actually a trait, actually. I think that's a trait. That is definitely a trait. I don't know if it's on my list, but I find that is a trait because I think like when high functioning autistic individuals can become really overwhelmed, having to sort of like navigate so many social situations and be aware of in time, be aware of every sort of scenario and how they are responding to that scenario becomes extremely draining. And so you can find yourself extremely tired. And I never realised before, it took me a long time to sort of figure out that this might be actually part of my, part of how my sort of response to having this sort of condition, being on a spectrum. But yeah, anyway, I digress. Let me go back. So, I mean, it's often said that many high functioning autistic people have just one friend. That's all they need. And as long as they have that one person or partner, they don't need anyone else, as they don't need extended levels of social contact. They would prefer to keep themselves occupied with their own special interests instead. Yes, I can absolutely 100% agree with that. And that fits me to a T, without a doubt, It should be made clear that while selective reclusiveness is a relatively common trait with high-function autistic people, there are many high-function autistic people who have greater difficulty interacting with other people due to the traits listed. And so to the extent that they are reclusive, it's more of an enforced social isolation. And I mean, that can create other problems for these sorts of people, and they can become really depressed and anxious because they are not accepted by society and they feel a forced reclusiveness, and so that's an important feature as well to sort of be aware of. And the other thing about this is that there are also many high functioning autistic people who have actually grouped together and integrated, and they sort of develop their own workplace or social group so that they can sort of work around like-minded people and they can have a shared interest which they can discuss at length with each other. And these could be considered what they have called the invisible autistics or high functioning autistic people who don't feel the need to actually go for a formal diagnosis and so never come into contact with any of the sort of clinical sector. And as a consequence, the research actually doesn't really know much about this type of autism. But I think what has been mentioned is that with these sort of invisible high functioning autistic people, as I sort of put it, and that's how it's actually described in in the research that I did on looking at these traits, you know. And again, I would refer people to Lydia Andal's brilliant book she did on Am I Autistic, because she really breaks down the subject really well. She's not, as far as I know, she's not a clinician either, but she's somebody who is, for her own reasons, decided to sort of focus on an interest in this group of people, and she's a journalist by background. But anyway, so a lot of these invisible high functioning autistic individuals, they can be found in places like Silicon Valley, for example. They are the sort of geek, if we could, you know, in quotes, you know, the geeks, in quotes, who kind of work as programmers. And that, I mean, this is just an example, but these sort of invisible high functioning autistic people never really, you know, they never really come to the attention of anybody for being sort of highly functioning autistic, and they are commonly found in the big tech industry, you know, and you know, they're known for sort of having unusual work environments, aren't they? I mean, let's just put it that way. They're very talented. They do have sustained employment, and they develop a strong social circle of people like them. And as a result, they don't often come across or run into the challenges that many less able, high functioning autistic people would find themselves in. You know, we're talking about the sort of, I think Steve Jobs, you know, you're talking about those programmers who have been extremely successful, you know, and it can happen also in sciences, it can happen in the financial sector, it can happen in the legal sector even as well, and it happens in the medical profession. A lot of invisible high functioning autistic people have extremely well above average successful careers, earn lots of money, and live a very comfortable life, or have the ability to live a very comfortable life. Although when you see them, and I think in quotes I would say somebody like Mark Zuckerberg and his sort of cohort, they, if you see them, they look very simple, you know, they live very fit, they're worth billions of pounds, for example, and they live very simple lives. And I think that can be translated into sort of just the ordinary high functioning autistic person who has a career, who, you know, doesn't necessarily make billions, but certainly we're talking about in the six-figure salaries for sure, and so able to live an extremely comfortable life. But often you wouldn't really see them and think that they, you know, because they don't sort of wear that lifestyle on their sleeves, you know. So we're talking about very talented people, and they have obviously sustained very good careers. They don't often run into challenges. And I think what we can sort of take from this, and what the literature just does say we can take from this, is that when higher functioning autistic people create environments for themselves where it's all about enabling them to function in a way that they are comfortable with, less anxiety, and they can, you know, do what they love doing, be creative, focus on the sort of work that interests them, is that it's not an impairment. You know, they don't experience their life as impaired in any way, shape or form, and neither does society. You know, the wider society does not view these individuals as in any way. And in fact, these individuals, if we are to sort of take it that a lot of the workforce for, say, Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, all the big tech industries that we know have been a part of the whole revolution of social media and so forth, and computer technology, they have literally led the way for us. You know, these people are the leaders, they're the innovators, and they probably always have been, is what the research says. And I think we'll come to that in sort of a separate series of talks. Yeah. So, you know, this high functioning autistic people are only experiencing this as a disorder when the environment doesn't facilitate the way that they need to be supported in order to be able to develop and evolve and be their best self, essentially, and contribute to society in a way that they would be able to if it weren't for the sort of norms that they are expected to fit into. So coming on to another set of traits which I sort of deal with together, and that is routines, repetition and rituals. And many high functioning autistic people have a strong preference for routines and a set structure in their life. We don't really know why high functioning autistic people tend to prefer order, structure and predictability. And I mean, this is a trait that is particularly seen in the most severe forms of autism. This is the one trait that always seems to be present, without a doubt. You know, in the most severe forms and in moderate forms of autism, where individuals cannot live without a group of support around them, because otherwise they would just not be able to navigate their world, and they would be at risk in every area of their activities of daily living, if I was to put it that way. This trait is always there, you know. And in higher functional autistic individuals, it's there, but it's there in a sort of in different ways that we wouldn't really pick up on unless you're around somebody who has higher functional autism. And so the main, I would say the main factor for all autistic people with this is that it can be extremely distressing if those routines and rituals, yes, or they're not able to carry out that repetition. If these routines, okay, are disrupted, it can be extremely distressing and create a lot of anxiety. And I think that is the case regardless of the severity of the autistic person, you know. So, I mean, these routines and rituals can cover anything in the life of the high functioning autistic person, including food, clothes, activities, and household objects. Routines can include eating exactly the same, literally eating exactly the same food at the same time every day, or wearing the same clothes every day, or different clothes which are identical, going for a walk or exercising at the same time every day, or insisting that certain brands of household products or toiletries are purchased in the house only, you know. And there can be some overlap here with obsessive compulsive disorder as well, for those of you who are interested in different sort of disorders of the personality, you know. So those high functioning autistic people with a preference for routine will benefit from working in a job which follows exactly the same routine or ritual every day. And on the other flip side of all this, any changes to a job or the environment in which people are working who have higher functioning autism, however small that could be, can cause high levels of anxiety and irritation. And that in itself can lead to another trait, which I'm going to cover, which is melting down, you know, meltdowns, but we'll come to that. Repetitive behaviour in high functioning autistic individuals is a physical behaviour which might involve lining up objects in a certain order, or the repetitive use of an object, example, repeatedly flicking a rubber band. And for those of you who listened to one of my previous episodes, I think it might have been episode 3 actually, where I spoke about my sort of repetitive behavior that I used to have. I don't do it so much anymore. And I think, generally speaking, over time, these repetitive behaviors do and can come less and less depending on the higher functioning autistic person. But I used to always need to be feeling like really soft, like I had a tissue that I used to always feel, and a pillow that could never be washed. And I used to have to always be smelling and feeling this soft t-shirt, that the more I felt it and the more it wasn't washed, the more soft it would become and the more soothing it would become. Oh my God, I just loved it so much, honestly. Yeah, and then I would suck my thumb as well. So anyway, so that's just sort of like how I found that affected me. In addition to always, I have loads of books. I would collect books. Most things that I have, I tend to form collections. So if I buy a lipstick, for example, this week, I bought the Maybelline long stay silk vinyl lipsticks. Yeah. Now I didn't go into the supermarket, to the super drugstore to get these lipsticks. I actually went to get a concealer that I needed, and I saw the lipstick and I thought, oh, I want to try that. And in typical fashion, I end up picking up all the colours, and I do this all the time. I end up doing this, and even colours that won't typically suit my skin tone, I still pick them up. Because in my mind, I say, okay, well, what I will do is I will use, like I say, a lip liner, and then that will sort of make that colour possible for my skin tone. But I don't know. I've just always done that. Always done that. So I think that's an example of repetitiveness. But it also includes things like, like I don't do this. I do collect books, but I don't categorize books. I do order them in height though. I don't order them in color, but I do order them in height. I am quite systemic in that way. But yeah, and it can be linked to systemizing or the preference for order. So whilst repetitive playing with an object can often be soothing to autistics, and it helps reduce anxiety, and that's true, because that's the reason why I would have my always feeling the t-shirt, and it would go everywhere with me. I remember I used to carry around this pillow as well. It wasn't just at bedtime. I would literally carry around. There would be that one pillow that I would carry around with me wherever I was sitting, and even if I was out, it would make me have to come back home. It would make me have to come back home, and I would have to be with my t-shirt and my pillow. And I've got two daughters who are like that as well, in different ways. Yeah, and I'll talk about what I've observed with my daughters in other episodes, and what the research shows, and I mean this just fits into what I've been saying, is that over time you do kind of regulate this type of behavior around others, as you kind of get older. But when sort of undergoing sort of different stresses or unusual stresses or quite significant stress, you can sort of revert back. And I would agree with that as well, because that is something that I experienced as well, sort of reverting back to using a pillow form or a t-shirt, or rocking, stimming. I would rock a lot. That's another thing I would do that I mentioned. I would rock, but I think that comes under stimming. But again, although it's stimming, it could be repetitive. It's still a repetitive pattern of doing something, Yeah. And I used to do it at certain times as well. I used to have to do it at certain times. And that can really affect how you sort of live your life on a daily basis, especially when you're younger. Absolutely. Mutism. So I think it's important with mutism to sort of say for start off that mutism is a trait that it's not exclusive to autistic individuals at all, and I think that's what the literature actually does say. So it does, the literature around this does actually say that selective mutism is not an autistic trait per se, as you can be selectively mute without being autistic. In autistics, this trait is often caused by sensory overload and frequency. It often occurs when child and adult autistics have a meltdown, and so is included in this guide, essentially. Yeah. With selective mutism, the autistic adult shuts down and becomes mute when they are experiencing a sensory overload triggered by high levels of anxiety or stress. And so I'm going to sort of describe some of the main differences between non-autistic children, and it is mainly children that this affects, and autistics who are selectively mute. Yes. So starting with non-autistic children. So what you'll find with non-autistic children who go selective mute is that it's more common in girls and children of ethnic minority populations who have recently migrated from their country of birth. Now that's interesting. That's very interesting, because I'm going to come back to that in a completely different, this idea of mutism and ethnic minority groups and females. I'm going to come back to that and deal with that in a whole nother subject matter. And also, more than 90% of children with selective mutism also have a social phobia or social anxiety. And remember, we're talking about non-autistic children or adults who decide to go selectively mute. Yeah. Another one is they often grow out of it with age. Okay. Another one is it mainly appears in unfamiliar environments outside of the home. And another one is that non-autistic children tend to respond to behaviour therapy, as the therapy focuses on reducing the anxiety, which is the trigger for the autism in the first place. Sorry, for the mute, for going selectively mute in the first place. Okay. So that is in complete contrast to selectively mute high functioning autistic or autistic children or adults, because their experience of selective mutism, it has no relation to the cultural backgrounds of the autistic person. It will activate both inside or outside of the home, in familiar and unfamiliar environments. It doesn't respond well to therapy. And when the children grow into adults, the trait can still remain. Okay. Even an accomplished high-functioning autistic can be rendered mute when sensory overload strikes. And I think that's very important to be aware of. Okay. So going on to another set of traits, and that is sensory differences. Okay. Just bear with me, because I need to remind myself. So this is essentially now, I think, sort of 21. This is the start of sensory differences, and I'm going to talk about 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, literally all together now. So these next 8 traits I'm going to be dealing with under sensory differences. All right. And so as we know, high functioning autistic people do experience the world differently, and this has a lot to do with the sensory differences that we experience compared to non-autistic neurotypical people. And I think that's the first thing to say. It's really because of these senses that lead to the experience of the world being completely different, and our reactions to it that really create all these traits. If we really were to sort of like take this and break this down to the sort of ultimate foundation, you know. And in actual fact, maybe have been wise of me to look at sensory differences to start with, because that really is the foundation for a lot of the other traits that manifest itself. And a key point about sensory differences, though, okay, is that, again, two things. They can operate, sensory differences do occur in non-autistic people as well, okay? So neurotypical people do have sensory differences, all right? And also something else is that with sensory differences, they can actually be a tremendous autistic advantage as well for the autistic person, you know, especially when it comes to, for example, if they have a creative skill or talent, right, or hobby, you know, and it can be such that it can lead to literally a high functioning autistic person or autistic person with a particular high sensory advantage really sort of making a lot of money as well, because of the talent that flows from having that sort of autistic sensory advantage. So I think that is something I wanted to point out, from the get-go. And also I would say that because of the sensory differences being so detailed, really, and topics within themselves, I'm actually going to do an episode on each sensory difference. So I'm going to look at eyesight, I'm going to look at visual thinking, I'm going to look at sound, I'm going to look at touch, I'm going to look at taste, I'm going to look at smell, I'm going to look at balance, and I'm going to look at the pros and cons and the autistic advantage of each of these senses in different episodes of this series, because I think, you're going to find it quite fascinating, actually, in understanding how autism and high functioning autism can be both an advantage and a disadvantage when it comes to sensory differences. So I mean, basically I've more or less summarized what those sensory differences are. But something else that's really important about these sensory differences, that especially when we're looking at it from the point of view that non-autistic neurotypical people can also have some of these differences. And what they have said around this is that when sort of non-autistic people present with some of these sensory differences, right, they may lead to behaviour that might appear, in quotes, a bit eccentric, and I think that would be the difference, So what do we mean by eccentric? And so let's just look that up, right? Because I think it's important that we do sort of define what we're saying. Really important. So eccentric, right? Eccentricity, right? So it really is looking at somebody who has behaviour that is unconventional or slightly strange in appearance to other people. All right. And it can be behaviour, or it can be opinions, slightly eccentric views on a particular topic as well, in which case it would be, slightly strange views as well as behaviour, Yeah, so that's what we mean when we're talking about eccentricity, all right? So that is completely different from what we're talking about when we're talking about autistic or highly functional autistic people having these sensory differences, all right? So whilst the debate actually continues around what is autism, which traits are uniquely autistic and which traits are simply more common in autistic people, certain sensory differences in brain wiring do seem to be exclusive and unique to higher functioning autistic people. And so that is why it's important that they should not be confused with in quotes, eccentric manners or behaviors or views, okay? Because what they do know is that there are differences in the brains and the way the brain develops for autistic people on the spectrum, regardless of whether you are most severely autistic or high functioning autistic. And so that is really key to sort of be aware of. So usually sensory differences materialize in the form of oversensitivity, okay? So someone can be oversensitive, which is termed as hypersensitive, or it can materialize in undersensitivity, which is hyposensitivity in certain areas which are summarized. And I sort of give examples of how different sensory perception can be a real strength to the in or high functioning autistic person, you know. So sight. So just sort of running through these very briefly, because as I said, I'm going to do a whole episode on each of these. But with sight, for example, it could be sensitivity to light that can cause distorted vision and cause images to blur, you know, and can cause objects to appear darker than they are, or cause difficulties with depth perception, and, you know. Yeah, exactly. It's not uncommon, and a lot of people will know that. Certainly, me and at least two of my children are have had to wear glasses ever since we were children. You know, one of my sons, he doesn't wear glasses, but he should, but he doesn't. Visual thinking. So this does sort of affect how we would see it. You think in pictures, you know. So sight, and that goes back to the whole sort of literal, please take a seat, and in your head you literally see, oh, I got to go and pick up a seat, or I got a frog in my throat. Literally, you would visualize a frog in somebody's throat, you know. So it's important to sort of say that, you know. Sound. And this is another one where high functioning autistic people are hypersensitive to sound. This can become magnified or distorted, and they may experience an inability to filter background noise, which leads to difficulty concentrated on work, study, or conversations. Some autistics with very sensitive hearing can hear conversations from long distances away, you know. And hyposensitivity, which is under sensitive to sound, may result in partial hearing, you know, hearing problems, a lack of response to certain sounds, or a preference for loud, noisy environments like racetracks or train stations, you know. Autistics with this trait may also enjoy banging or shaking objects to hear a certain sound. Touch. And again, this feeds into my, I would say, my need that I had for feeling my soft t-shirt. But hypersensitivity to touch can be extremely unpleasant for autistic people, who might find even the slightest touch uncomfortable or even painful at worst. Clothing can also be an issue, and it can feel scratchy and uncomfortable to some. And sort of in more severe sort of autistic adults, they will only wear what, or actually all, let me just say all autistic, I think this affects all people on the spectrum actually, they will only wear what they're really comfortable with. And I mean, I suppose most people would anyway, wouldn't they? But certainly I know I spoke in another episode about how I had this thing about bedding. You know, as a child growing up, there was certain bedding I just couldn't sleep on. I just wouldn't feel comfortable. I can't explain it. And even now, I mean, now it doesn't affect me so much, because now obviously I buy my own bedding, you know, I sort of dictate my own sleeping arrangements. But back when, obviously, when you're a child and you're growing up, you don't really have control over those things, do you? And you have to sort of like, you know, sleep where you're told you've got to sleep and so forth. So That was something that was a problem for me. I remember that very clearly. Yeah, I remember we used to have these blankets back in the days. We didn't have quilts. You had blankets, and when you washed them, they would form these bubbles, and I used to hate the look of it. It used to like make me cringe, and the idea that that would sort of be touching against my skin, I would just wouldn't sleep. I wouldn't sleep. I would literally just not use them and be really cold all night. Oh gosh, I remember it so well, honestly. But yeah, touch. Yeah, and obviously hyposensitivity can result in sort of dangerously high thresholds because people can literally be burnt and not feel it, literally, you know. And my mother had this problem. Like I said, I believe this affected my mother. Like I said, when she was ill and she experienced pain, or should have been experiencing pain, in our opinion, she had been cancer, but we didn't know before she passed away that it was actually cancer. She had huge swelling. She was diagnosed with lymphoma, but I didn't know if she was in pain or not. She wasn't expressing any sort of being in pain. She would just say that her ankles are swollen, her knees are looking swollen. She wouldn't express being in pain at all, you know? Yeah. And again, if you just think about the temperature of water, I mean, I love the heat. It's something I am acutely aware of. I love the heat and I hate the cold. I hate the cold. But I'm going to talk about that. Obviously, when I sort of touch on this subject in more detail, I'll talk about how I think this affects me and gives me a certain advantage as well. But another one is taste. So hypersensitivity to food can result in a restricted diet. As a highly functioning autistic person can have taste buds and sort of strong taste buds, or be averse to strong flavors of foods, which could provoke an intense reaction. In addition to the taste of food, certain autistic people can be very sensitive to textures, and the feel of food in their mouth. They might prefer soft or smooth foods. And hyposensitivity will often include a preference for very strongly flavoured spicy foods, they have said. So you might have a tolerance for sort of a lot of pepper in your food, I mean, again, that's cultural, though. That can be very cultural specific as well. So, yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it, when it comes to looking at these issues. Smell. So people with high functioning autism can be having a very strong reaction to strong smells that are quite intense and overpowering. And I think it's important to say that with all these sensory differences, when they are at a level that's intolerable for the person who is having the autistic person, they can lead to meltdowns because the reaction can be so distressing. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind. So smells can sort of trigger a wide range of scenarios. And you can just imagine, I mean, if you're sort of in a lift with somebody who's got a strong smell of perfume on that the highly functional autistic person just cannot cope with, that can be, obviously very distressing, walking past, you might be really sensitive to walking past bins that haven't been emptied, for example, when you're walking on the street. I mean, I know most people with, but can you imagine being having a hypersensitivity to smells of all sorts, right? And to the point where it's almost painful. And so you're walking past, like on a summer's day or something, when there's loads of bins that just haven't been emptied. I mean, yeah, not good at all, let's talk about the hyposensitivity, that's so the undersensitivity can almost lead to having no sense of smell at all, and that sort of like really sort of without smell you can't even really taste your food, can you? You sort of really don't. It's, you know, I mean, a lot of pleasure in life comes from our senses, doesn't it? You know, I mean, that's just the bottom line. A lot of pleasure in our life actually comes from our ability to experience the world through our senses. Yeah, and if as a high functioning autistic person, if you have sort of undersensitivity to smell, it can affect your own personal hygiene. You know, the ability to be aware that, you know, you might need to use deodorant. You know, that you need to wash because your odor is quite strong. Your personal odor might be quite strong, and likewise around other people as well, and sort of sensing their odor. You might sort of you could be at risk of not knowing when food has gone off and eating, you know, out of date foods. Yeah, and so I mean, one of the things they say, I mean, I've never sort of had this experience. This is not something I experience in a sense of smell. But one of the things they do say is that autistic people who have this problem, they will often lick food. Okay, so they rely on their sense of taste as opposed to smell to sort of get an idea of if something is you know, gone off or not, really. Yeah. So that's all I'll say on that one for now. And the next one is balance. So people with high functioning autism with a hypersensitivity, say we are talking about vestibular, okay? Vestibular balance, okay? May find it difficult to coordinate their movements, which causes difficulties with walking down the street or sporting activities. They may also experience motion sickness. And that is something I never realised, everybody. I never realised that thing about motion sickness. My daughter has that. My youngest daughter has that. And I never realised that was potentially a trait of autism at all, you know, at all. I mean, I know that I have issues with my coordination, my sort of, you know, sort of coordinating movement between my arms and my legs at the same time. So dancing could be a problem for me. You know, certain dances that people can do, I wouldn't be able to do it because my sort of coordination with my body balance and so forth, just generally coordinating my body balance and movement would be problematic for me. You know, I'm very rigid, very sort of rigid. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I could do the same mode. Like, I love cycling. I love cycling. That is my main form of exercise, is to cycle and walk, because they're easy, simple. I get those. But anything else that requires sort of exercise where you've got to sort of balance yourself and coordinate your arms with your legs to get what they call proper form. Is that what they call it? Get the right form. If not, you could cause yourself an injury. That is a problem for me, you know. And it sort of never occurred to me. Sorry if you hear a noise in the background. That's one of my daughter sort of going out, bless her. But yeah, it never sort of dawned on me that that's might be one of the reasons why certain sort of exercises just doesn't appeal to me. You know, like there's that machine. What do they call it? The epileptic. See. My speech, guys, honestly, in my profession, I've learned the words I need to use so that I can pronounce them properly. But outside of my sort of legal jargon world, when I have to pronounce certain words, this is where you see I'm affected by my speech, you know, and language when it comes to pronunciation because of my lisp. I have a lisp. So basically, the epileptical machine, I'm sure I'm sort of not saying that properly, but you know what I mean. That machine where you've got to row with your arms and move your legs up and down at the same time. I hate that. I just can't deal with that. Honestly, it's just sort of like requires too much thinking for me to get it right. And then I will become exhausted just thinking about it. So yeah, so balance. So hypersensitive vestibular balance system, that is, some people have. And then we're talking about now the opposite, which is the undersensitive vestibular system, uh, where people may find it difficult to assess their own sense of balance and may need to rock, swing, or spin to gain a sense of how they are positioned. I mean, I don't know whether this has got anything to do with why, I think I mentioned in one of my videos, why in terms of my eyesight, because I mean, what I think is important to remember about these traits is that any one, two, or three of them or more could actually swing into action at the same time simultaneously, you know? So, for example, what I mean by that is obviously you can have an oversensory reaction, all right, in any one of these traits, and at the same time, because you're having an oversensory reaction, you're also having a meltdown, all right. And at the same time, you may become mute, unable to sort of express yourself. And so all these traits can happen simultaneously together, all right? And, you know, and be experienced in that way, which obviously makes the whole sort of experience at that particular time all the more distressing. So when we're talking about sort of the ability to under assess or not be aware of your own sense of balance and sort of, you know, how you sort of compensate through rocking, swinging, or spinning, yeah, I wonder whether that is part of my own sort of way I sort of focus my eyesight, because as I was saying in one of my videos, is that I have a certain way where I can't focus my eyesight or my ability to sort of focus and see visually, right, what I'm trying to see doesn't happen for me unless my head is slightly turned to the left. Okay, and I don't start out that way. It kind of just veers towards that way. And so I wonder whether that is partly my balance is off to try to sort of assist my sight, you know. It's something I never really thought about, but it would make sense. It would absolutely make sense, you know, because I don't really have that ability to sort of, you know, I just have the ability to sort of understand how, well, sort of how do you, and I find myself sort of moving my head around, well, where should I position my head to be able to see this comfortably without, you know, thinking that I'm creating a sort of permanent condition of my head always looking like it's, you know, I'm giving someone a dirty look, the side eye, as I put it, I think in that conversation. So that's balance. So coming to body awareness generally, and I think again this is an important area for high functional autistics in their sort of body awareness generally, their space, the position, their space that they take up in the world, you know. So I mean, it's called proprioception formally. Body awareness is proprioception. Okay, and it's to do with your sense of personal space. And they say this is actually a very common autistic sensitivity, you know, and an autistic person who has hypersensitive body awareness is likely to be incredibly sensitive to anyone venturing into their personal space and may react strongly if their personal boundaries are breached, you know. Common space breaches for autistic adults, and by autistic adults, I'm specifically, as everybody is aware, dealing with people with high functioning autism might involve walking down a crowded street, being jostled by other passengers on public transport, or working in an office environment where the person next to them is sat too close. I for sure can tell you one of my hates of ever having to work in a office environment in the, I would say, 2010s upwards, when, as some of you may be aware, I have local authority client departments who I work with as their lawyer and legal advisor, and sometimes I would have a ability to go into the office to sort of do whatever I might need to do. I mean, I work from my own sort of chambers and so forth, but I've always obviously had access to council offices to be able to carry out my work. And specifically, when I was a social worker, and I worked in offices then, local government offices. The thing that I hated the most was this whole hot desking, everybody. I detest it. That whole thing where you don't have a dedicated desk space. And not only is there hot desking, but there is, the whole purpose of it is because, we're trying to minimize space. We are trying to save money by reducing the amount of office space that we make available to staff. And so although we might have a team of 15, we only have 10 desks. And so because of this, people have to book a desk. And because of this, these desks, the way they are set up is like, little cubicles, right? Sometimes you might have a partition, but most often there was no partition. So you'd literally have these sort of like pods, desk pods, they would call them. So you might have 4 or 6 in a pod, okay? And they were hot desks. So you would literally have to set yourself up for however long you were going to be there on that particular occasion, all right? But you couldn't own it. You couldn't nest in that desk. I hated it. Absolutely hated it. One, because it's so against how I can operate, with not liking change and liking everything set up and ordered in a way that makes me feel comfortable. Okay, and I think, outside of being high functioning autistic, I think that is generally how humans are. We like to nest, I think. Most people like to have sort of own a personal space, right? And feel comfortable if they're going to be working somewhere for a sort of, day in and day out situation. But also, I mean, the size and the sort of, like I said, each pod, the amount of space that would be available, you'd really be close to someone else. And, you couldn't really extrapolate yourself from their activities, what they were doing. That was something that I hated. And, how people were productive and how, people are productive in those environments, I just will never know, especially when it comes to like work that requires critical thinking and analysis, and preparation, like being being in a profession where you work with other people, and you have to produce reports. You have to analyze data, you have to interview people. You know what I mean? You have to plan, you have to, do all these different sort of high grade critical thinking tasks. And you got to do it with people around you, sort of in a very defined space, and everybody's on the phone or whatever they do. I mean, honestly, I absolutely hated it, honestly. And I could just not ever function in that sort of environment, So for people who are on the spectrum, in having to work in that situation, it must be a nightmare, honestly, because I hated it. I absolutely hated it. So that was my rant. Sorry, everybody. That's my rant on that. But honestly, if that is one of your pet hates and you actually, feel me on this, please leave a comment, honestly, because I'm sure I can't be the only person. And as I say, I don't even think that is, I think that's general sort of sort of working humans, beings, and how we are. We like our space. This whole idea. And then hygiene. I mean, I know things are different since we had the pandemic, although I don't know. I really don't know because I haven't really been in an office. But anyway, let me move on. So talking about the undersensitivity now. So if you're sort of undersensitive in the area of body awareness, that can result in higher functional autistic people breaching the personal space of others by inadvertently standing too close or accidentally bumping into people, as they cannot effectively measure their proximity to other people. They may also find it hard to navigate rooms without bumping into things. I had a friend like this, bless her. And again, I don't know whether it's, I'm not suggesting she was high functional autistic, but she was quite clumsy. She would bump into things. Yeah. My daughter's a bit like that, actually. Thinking about, I've got a younger daughter like that. I'm talking through some of these traits, and it really is making me think about some elements of family members that I hadn't really thought about until actually going through this list. So I'm finding that very helpful. Finding that extremely helpful. And I wonder whether this hyposensitivity to body awareness could actually spread out into the wider environment for, say, hoarders. People like me who... I mean, I'm not a messy, unhygienic hoarder, but I think most people who have the traits for collecting and, take your interest to that extent, like what we were talking about in previous traits, right? So you might collect books, you might collect, like me, makeup, for example. I mean, as you go through life, you find that you accumulate huge amounts of stuff, right? That you then have to find somewhere to put this stuff. And the problem is the idea that actually you need to give some of this stuff away, you need to sort some of this stuff out, you don't need this stuff, you're not using this stuff, is a real problem for people who I would say have this trait and are highly functioning autistic people. All right. So I wonder whether, because of that, it can lead to a sort of unawareness of how this is actually affecting your personal space, because the reality is, I think I can hear my cat tussling. Lego. Oh, Lego, I hope you're not tussling with another bird. Sorry, everybody. So I wonder, whether this sort of trait could come into play with that sort of lack of awareness of how all this sort of collectibles, if I should put it that way, the more sort of friendly term, take up your personal space, your environment. It gradually becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, which then obviously the smaller your space becomes, the less able you are to sort of navigate it without actually becoming clumsy, to a certain extent. It's interesting. I'm going to think on that and talk about that more in when I break down and look at these different traits in an episode all of their own, literally. So going on to talk about sensory overload and meltdowns, and this is all about how high functional autistic people in general though, but I'm focusing on high functional autistic people have reactions to sensory sensitivities in different ways, and the one thing that I think they have found that is common, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, right, from the most severe to the most high functioning, is that when these sensitivities, these sensory sensitivities really do become intolerable or uncomfortable or create anxiety or create irritability or have any kind of profound impact at that moment in time on the individual person, all right, it leads to what they call meltdowns. Yeah. And what meltdowns are, they are a trigger when one or more senses that the high functioning autistic person is having get so overloaded with the input coming in via that sensory, yeah, that it leads to them literally freaking out, right? It literally leads to them freaking out in some way within themselves, either intrinsically or externally, right? But usually it manifests in an extrinsic reaction, right? So an external reaction, right, will generally be the outcome of a meltdown. Okay. So these meltdowns, what are they? I mean, meltdowns are usually acts of aggression. It could be anything though. It could be self-harm. It could be challenging behavior, different forms of challenging behavior. It could be going mute, shutting down. It could be having to go away and have to stim. You know, there's no defined way that an autistic person or a person with higher functioning autism, when they have this experience of being overloaded, right, via one or more of their senses to the point where it's overwhelming, they have a meltdown. And the whole point of a meltdown is to calm oneself. It's to be able to cope with that particular overload. All right, self-soothe, be able to cope with what's actually going on with the person at that particular time. All right, and I mean it's a whole topic, and I will sort of go, as I said, go into that in a separate episode, including, generally speaking, how to sort of avoid getting to that point. And I think this is something I've looked at because, as I as I've said to everybody over the years, I have learned to rely less and less on stimming and on certain self-soothing ways of coping with my anxieties and traumas. That became less when I was in my 30s. Not the traumas, but the ways that I managed to learn to cope and deal with the traumas and events in my life that overwhelmed me. I have learned to deal with them through other means, and very rarely have to rely on some of the ways I self-soothe, but also knowing exactly what my meltdowns are and dealing with them as well. So I will talk about that in a separate episode, you know. And so another trait, and I think we're sort of almost finished now, but another trait is special interest. And I think this is one that, I mean, obviously everybody can have a special interest. You know, you don't need to be autistic to have special interest. But I think the sort of key sort of differences here are that when the autistic person has like a special interest, they can literally lose a sense of reality and sort of the whole routine. They could become so obsessed with the self-interest, with the special interest, that they sort of, it starts to take over their world, you know. They will sort of like super focusing on it. They could spend a lot of money on it. They could spend all their time on it to the point where their routines collapse and they don't eat, they don't sleep, you know. And I think some of this is going back to the sort of Silicon Valley and tech world, and when we hear about some of the stories and the way that some of the early innovators, when they were sort of in the early days of developing software, for example, you know, Bill Gates and all these sorts of, you know, well-known social media innovators, right? and software innovators, we often read about, or in their stories and in the films when we watch about their life stories, we see how they and their sort of group of fellow creators and innovators would often sort of be together in a house for days and weeks, literally not washing, not sleeping, eating sort of fast food at odd hours, just because they were so focused on sort of working on this creative project that they had, in mind. And so it's all about the ability really to sort of lose a sense of balance, I would say. Focusing on this special interest to the point where you can lose balance, and you need and that obviously has advantages to that, but obviously if people's routine collapses to the point where it becomes unhealthy for them, because clearly if you're not sleeping, that is not healthy. Or it becomes also, like, for example, it puts you in debt because you're so sort of focused on buying what is necessary for this special interest. You put yourself in debt, you could spend all your savings on it. So it's got obviously pros and cons, this special interest. But again, that is a subject that I will sort of go into all on itself, really. In another separate episode. So there's two more that I need to just touch on. And stimming, again, that is self-stimulating behaviour, also known as stimming and self-stimulation. And it's the repetition of physical movements and or sounds, or the repetitive movements of objects, and is very distinctive. It's a very distinctive autistic trait in the mostly severe and moderately autistic individuals. Although not all higher functioning autistic people display this in a way that would be familiar to observers, okay? And in my own case, right, I used to rock, and I have a daughter who would rock, and also she would sort of rhythmically headbang as well. Not hard, obviously, but lightly, sort of rhythmically headbang as she would sort of rock herself, And again, it can consist of flapping of your hands and repeated touching or stroking of certain fabrics or textures, which I've talked about. And what they say is, whilst there's a lot of debate as to why these behaviours arise, a commonly accepted view is that stimming utilises the different sensory processes of the autistic person and is used as a way to relieve negative emotions and unpleasant feelings or experiences, And so I'm going to obviously talk more about that and the negative sides of that, because obviously it can have dangers if you're banging your head, for example, and especially if that is coexisting with, say, another trait, say for one of the senses where you're undersensitive to touch. You might not be aware you're actually hurting yourself because you can't feel the pain in that way. Okay, and the last one, systemizing, and this is a trait where it's about the drive to analyze or construct a system, with a system being anything that follows rules or laws. A system can be mechanical, it can be abstract, it can be natural. So a system can be mechanical as in a car, or abstract as in numbers or patterns, or natural as in the weather, or collectibles as in collecting books and DVDs, which is something that I've spoken about, my collectible nature. All right. So I'm going to talk about these, as I said, in separate series, but essentially that now covers all 33 over 2 episodes, episode 3 and episode 4, of the main traits that you will find in autistic people from at different levels, okay, and from the most severe to the most high functioning autistic individuals of both genders. You can find these traits to varying degrees. So thank you very much for watching this episode. Please give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you thought I did a terrible job of this, and please subscribe give me that motivation that I need to carry on making these videos. I'm certainly enjoying it. It's helping me, and I hope that my subscribers are people who, if they don't feel they are on the spectrum themselves, at least if you know family members or friends, please share the videos, and let's just share our experiences together. Leave a comment. Start please leaving comments about your understanding, or if I've missed anything that you can think of about yourself or your family members. Please do share. And although I am really focused on women, I do welcome the views of men, specifically men who are higher functioning autistic as well. If you come across this channel in your mature years, how's it affecting you now?